great to see standing in the audience. It reminds me of being at Murrayfield over 30 years ago when it was standing only. There'll be a few of you that remember those days probably. So I'm going to tell you a bit about procurement in the NHS in Scotland because I think there was some feedback at this event. You would like to see a bit more NHS presence. I recognise that local authority in Scotland Excel is a driver for a lot of you, but what I'll try and do today is talk a bit about the NHS and where the opportunities may lie and the areas that I think you should focus on if you want to gain business with the NHS and the way it's moving forward. But let me give you a bit of context first. So NHS Scotland employs around 160,000 people at a cost of £12 billion a year. This makes the NHS one of the largest employers in Scotland. Of that 12 billion cost base, 2.4 billion is on goods and services with suppliers. We use about 13,000 suppliers, and 50% of that spend is with our top 50 suppliers. And I think you'll recognise that there's a difference with local authority type spend in that we have a lot of spend in the pharmacy sector and with large medical devices, MRI scanners and things like that. NHS Scotland is structured with 14 geographical health boards, which are highlighted on this slide. There are also 8 national health boards, and those are things like the Scottish Ambulance Service, NHS 24, and National Services Scotland that I work for. National Services Scotland is like the COO function in a private business. So we have IT, we have logistics, and we have procurement as a function, and it's that procurement function that I head up. National procurement in the NHS was created 10 years ago. My central team has about 80 people made up of procurement professionals and some clinical professionals. And one of the reasons I joined was having that clinical expertise sitting in my team is vital in terms of credibility. And one of the things that I would say when you're creating a procurement function, you have to have credibility with your stakeholders. Scotland, in terms of health, is well down the league table for Western Europe generally. We have huge inequalities between our affluent areas and our more deprived areas. So there is overall a need to improve Scotland's health. We have an ageing population with increasingly complex care needs, and that's putting increased demands on our services. But that increased demand is being met with reduced budgets in real terms, putting huge financial pressure on the service. So I think you can see the challenge that the NHS is facing in Scotland. I now want to talk a bit about the procurement world and how we're trying to react to that. My national procurement team is focused on 3 key areas: pharmacy, medical devices, and non-medical areas. So in the pharmacy world, we spend around 500 million a year on medicines in the acute sector. We actually spend another $1 billion on medicines in the primary care sector, prescribed through GPs or prescribed through the home care sector. On medical type devices, we spend 700 million a year, and we have 800,000 part numbers in there, just to give you a feel for the scale of the problem. And in our non-medical areas, we spend around 1.2 billion, and we have no idea how many part numbers we have in there. I think one of the messages I want to leave about this is over the last 10 years, we've been through a number of cycles of tendering, and I think we're beginning to run out of options in terms of simple cost reduction. So the challenge is, how do we deliver both cost savings and new added value going forward? Well, I think most of you will be familiar with this type of approach. This is the traditional supplier approach, where we talk a bit about price, and if we're a bit advanced, we talk about cost and maybe whole life cost. We definitely talk about quality and reliability. We might talk about functionality of what we're buying. We might talk about, well, how do we implement it? What's the change process? But where do we need to go for the future? I think this is no different to what happens in the private sector, to be honest, with the kind of key areas of zones A, B and C. So zone A is preparing for what you want to do, and I think the more you invest in zone A, the better your outcome will be. And that's where I think historically in the public sector there's maybe not enough engagement with suppliers. We've maybe moved very quickly into zone B and preparing tender documents and going to market. For us, Route 1 is fairly simple. That's what happens in the health boards. So typically across the health boards, if you're spending under 2,000, we're looking for evidence for value of money. If you're spending 2 to 10,000, it's 3 verbal or written quotations. 10 to 50,000, it's actually getting written quotes and beginning to follow the process. And I think in a lot of places, you don't really have to be a procurement professional to do that. Where procurement professionalism becomes more important is when you move into the higher value, higher risk stuff. I do on this particular slide just want to draw some attention to the box in red that talks about engagement with health boards. One of the areas that Scotland is very advanced in compared to England as well in this is that through national procurement and the health boards, we have category advisory panels. We engage with over 3,000 healthcare professionals across the service to decide on what we want to buy. So procurement doesn't have a budget. It doesn't make those decisions about we're going to buy X from this particular organisation. The category advisory panels are the decision-making bodies on which procurement sit. And if you're familiar with England, that sits separately from procurement at the moment, and they're beginning to try to align it because you need to have those commercial discussions earlier on in the process. So what do we want that's different going forward? First, I want to see a much greater focus on patient outcomes. That may be through us using existing data on how it impacts a patient, how it improves their recovery time, how it reduces their stay in hospital or reduces the number of return visits to hospital. Or it might be by supporting new data coming through trials or pilots before we make a decision. I think in the procurement world, we need to be more open to innovation and encourage that across our supplier community. And we're doing that at the moment by working very closely with academic institutions, with organisations like Scottish Enterprise and Highlands and Islands Enterprise. But I do want to try and bust the myth that procurement is a blocker to innovation. It's not if you involve us early enough and let us help you answer some of the questions that are on this slide. So in the right-hand box, there's no point having a great idea if nobody wants it, or if nobody can afford it, or if we're not sure if it's going to work, or in fact if you don't know what's going on in the market and if anyone else has developed it and we might already be testing it. So talk to us early and we can begin to help you answer some of those questions. And while I won't dwell on this side particularly, there are 10 key areas that we want to focus on in relation to the NHS's open innovation challenges. You'll see there are some common themes if you read this slide, and I think the slides will be circulated afterwards. It's really about reducing hospital admissions, reducing length of stay, and freeing up clinical staff time. If you can help us achieve those objectives, it will help us work with you more proactively. And then the final area, which I guess is less traditional, it's about sustainable procurement in its widest sense, whether it's ethical, social, environmental, if it's working more with SMEs that are Scottish-based or supported businesses. It's about ensuring fair work practices, and it's about identifying community benefits. And there were some good examples in there from Scotland Excel. For me, I'd sum it up as it's about supporting NHS Scotland, Scottish Government, and the population of Scotland to improve health and quality of life. We are asking for information on this in our tenders as we move forward. and we'll be devoting a large part of our first annual procurement report, which gets rolled up into a wider ministerial report next year as part of procurement across the public sector on these areas. It's an area that we will refine and develop and grow as we move forward. So I hope I've illustrated there the importance of patience, innovation and sustainable procurement in addition to the traditional measures relating to cost. So I just want to finish up. In the public sector, I've learned over the last 18 months we do have processes and rules and regulations that we have to follow. We have to recognise that as suppliers are in this to make a profit. Well, hopefully most of you are, otherwise I guess you won't be here for very long. What we want to do is stimulate activity that supports the wider Scottish Government agenda. But most of all, we want to deliver better outcomes for our patients. I'll finish there. Thank you.